So I did California. California is, for those who don't know, on the west coast of the United States. It is one of the densest, has one of the states with the densest populations in the United States, which is partially why I wanted to look into it. But I also had heard about their technological approach to um, attacking the COVID-19 pandemic, and I did want to learn more about that. I also want to learn about how the municipalities and the state government, their argument, their very public arguments on how to handle the pandemic and how to reopen. I did want to learn more about that, so that's why I chose California. So just to get an idea of their initial situation, as I just said, they're one of the densest states per capita in the United States, but they're also one of the largest state. They are the largest state economy in the United States, making up 14.8% of the US GDP, which is almost double the next largest state GDP, which is Texas. They also have, I don't think it's the largest, but one of the most international airports out of any states, including Los Angeles County, San Francisco. So that did allow the virus to enter and stay and gave them an initial disadvantage when compared to other states. So looking at their timeline, they did have the first case, first confirmed case by the CDC in the United States, but they were also the first to have a shelter-in-place order when looking at other states. And I'll get into how they're able to make that determination early on a little bit later. But one part of the timeline that I do want to draw attention to is that they were able to reopen things far earlier than other states, but had to then close certain kinds of businesses and restaurants and bars later on, just a few weeks later. And that was a confrontation that happened between the state and local governments, which I can go to a little bit later. But I also want to draw attention to the fact that certain counties, such as the Bay Area County, had shelter-in-place orders before the state government. So before the entire state shut down at once, individual counties were making up their own decisions on whether or not to shut everything down and keep everyone at home. And this is just the chart of the daily infections and testing. So one thing to note is that while the number of daily infections increased over time, there is a much higher rate of infection and more volatile rate of infection later on, as California was able to get this under control or flatten the curve initially, but later lost control of in-state infections as we got more towards the summer. So one of the major challenges that California had was defiant local officials and counties. So California is comprised of several smaller local governments in the forms of counties. And while the rates of infection did increase statewide, they did not increase equally. The amount of infections did not increase uniformly across all of the counties. And so while certain areas like the Bay Area and the San Francisco area had a lot of COVID cases and infections, some smaller counties with lower populations that were not as close to international airports did not see those rise in cases. And so while they did have to, while the state government did force those smaller counties to also close down and have shelter-in-place orders, they were upset because they also had to have the same kind of economic struggles that came with the shutdown. So they were upset that they had to close down even though they didn't have cases, and their economy was being damaged even though they didn't have these cases. So some of the local ordinances decided to defy the stay-at-home order and reopen anyway, which caused a backlash. And eventually the state government caved, revised their reopening plan, and in order to appease these smaller counties, which just made everything worse, made the number of COVID case infections get out of control and caused them to close everything again. So in terms of this plan, which had to be revised, originally Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, announced in April, a initial reopening strategy. But after revising that to appease these smaller counties, then they had to revise it again in August to a much more simplified version of this plan, which took into account the number of positive cases, the number of new cases, and stressed that in order to move between different risk levels, they would need to maintain a certain number of infections and cases for 2 weeks. This revised plan also changed which businesses were allowed to open when moving between different risk tiers. One very interesting part of California's strategy was using the company Bluedot. So this talks more about the AI technological side of California's approach, where they worked with a startup in Toronto, which bills itself as the smoke alarm for disease outbreak. So while there is a fire of an outbreak and embers shooting across the world, they want to be able to detect that in real time before everyone else. And the California state government used the Insight platform that Bluedot provides to monitor flights coming into the state, and where people who got off of those flights, how they moved throughout different parts of the state. So they used anonymized cell phone data to track different citizens and foreign nationals who entered the state, and then see how they gathered, where they went, and make better predictions on how this would affect different hospital systems in different counties. So if you're able to model the spread of the virus throughout the state, that can give you a better idea of how different hospital systems in different counties will feel a strain later on. And so this allowed the state to better decide how they should distribute PPE and necessary resources to different hospital systems and figure out when they might have an influx of cases later on. An interesting fact about Bluedot also is that they published the first paper on COVID in January, long before it was well known that the coronavirus was a pandemic that was moving throughout the world. And based on the information that California got from Bluedot, they were able to determine that they needed a shelter-in-place order, which prompted them to be the first state to have a shelter-in-place order. So the main takeaways that I took away from California's COVID response: first, don't ease restrictions too early. Don't cave to the local governments and revise your plan. You have to also maintain a consistent plan. Changing the plan on everyone midway through can just confuse the citizens and make it harder to have everyone be on the same page of how we're going to proceed with this pandemic. And lastly, the advantage of modeling spread and being able to better contact trace through different means of anonymized cell phone data, tracking flights, tracking individual people, so that you're not looking at a lagged indicator, but really a real-time, aggregated, live model of the spread. And those are my sources.
All right, thank you, James. Any question for James?
So what was Bluedot exactly? Was it an app that California had developed, or?
No, it's a startup in Toronto, which California used. So they used their Insight platform to get a better understanding of how this disease was spreading throughout the state.
That's cool.
So just a quick question. Did they monitor even state-to-state traffic, or was it just international traffic?
Yeah, so they modeled, so you're asking about Bluedot in particular and their approach?
Yeah.
Sure, so they in late December, early January had their software read a series of incoming reports from the Hubei province and predicted that there was a likely outbreak of something coming from that area. California, who used that software, they used that software to both track how people who were coming from that province were moving into the state. So they used flight data and they used cell phone data. And then they also were able to use that same software and insights from that software to model how those people were going to move throughout the state, and also see how they were actually moving throughout the state. So it's really, to answer your question, flights and anonymous cell phone data. Not necessarily state to state. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Do you know if this technology or like this approach was shared with other states and whether other states are using this? Because I would assume like at least they would share it with like, or should share it with Oregon and Washington, which are pretty close to them.
Yeah, so I do know that they used it in Illinois, particularly in Chicago. I'm not sure how the software was used in other states.
Okay, let's thank.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Just
Do you have any data to show, Ryan?
No, just an observation. Like, so one would think that if you have a stronger economy, you'd be able to withstand these economic effects better, right? So I remember Germany's Angela Merkel making a comment that, hey, we have a strong backbone and we got this. Also, we saw last week about Singapore doing a really great job. But this case sort of presents the counter argument to it, that, hey, California is a huge economy. And when you have a large economy, you also have more to lose. And that is like more evident from James's write-up that some counties defied the state orders and they locally reopened bars. Perhaps they had more to lose and that caused panic. And perhaps, that is having a counter effect than giving them more confidence in their abilities. I thought that's very interesting.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think part of it is that I don't know Germany's COVID situation too well, but I would imagine that their infection spread across the entire country rather than hitting certain areas very hard and other areas not as hard. Whereas in California, it was definitely the case where certain areas were hit very hard, and then there were other areas that were just seemingly closing for no reason. So I think it does provide a very interesting counter argument, but with that little addendum also.
Very interesting. Thank you.